Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 6, Halacha 2. If you're looking in the art scroll, we're in 47b2. Halacha 2 is going to be about this land in Syria. Now, the history about that was that King David was supposed to take parts of Eretz Yisrael that Hashem had commanded to take all the way back from conquering the land. But what happened was some of these Canaanite cities were too strong. And an opportunity came up where David could come along and invade up to Syria. And what happens is he ends up having a successful war there, and he annexes it. Now, there's something that happens here because this conquest was not part of when you have a Jewish army coming for Am Yisrael to do it. This is a personal conquest, and it's a conquest by an individual. You can see more about this story in Avodah Zarah 21a. And because that it's not like taking the land of the Canaanite lands, it has this different status. And the sages had a debate about what to do with it. Now, it doesn't really have the full sanctity of Eretz Yisrael proper. That's why this is not talked about in chapter 6, Halacha 1. And in some ways, it's also going to be treated like Eretz Yisrael, and some ways it's going to be treated like Chutz La'aretz. Now, Rashi is going to identify Syria as a place called Aram Sova in Berachot 36a. And the idea is that, according to Rashi, Aram Nehia is not part of Syria. And according to Rashi's view, it's going to be just that part, and it's not going to be what other Rishonim say, which is going to be that it's also Aram Naharaim. So there's different parts within this land of Syria that ends up getting conquered as well. And by the way, the Beur Halacha is going to go with Rashi on this, but the Yerushalmi in Chala 2.1 is going to say that David conquered both Aram Sova and Aram Naharaim. So there's some evidence here with the text that perhaps this extra place is part of the conquest. Now, this is an issue because the conquest of Syria is going to be considered done before all of the rest of Eretz Yisrael that Hashem promised to the Jews gets conquered. And that's going to be part of the issue. So there's in some way a deficiency in David's conquest because he goes and he does this before going and taking the rest of Am Yisrael, of Eretz Yisrael. But nonetheless, this land was taken. So now what do you do with it? So you still had, this is King David. King David is the one who wrote Tehillim. Tehillim is the song of the Jewish people. When we have a heartache, we sit and we turn to Tehillim. And this was done with a kosher Jewish army. What do we do with this land? How do we treat it? What's the status of it? So the Mishnah is talking about Syria. The Mishnah says one may work with detached produce in the normal manner in Syria, but not with attached produce. So this is talking about Sheviis, and in Eretz Yisrael, where processing of produce after it's detached from the ground has to be performed in a altered manner in some sort of different way. In Syria, if you process detached produce, it can be done normally. Why is that? Because this Mishnah is saying that Syria is not considered like part of Eretz Yisrael because the conquest is an individual conquest and it's not a national conquest. So the rabbis are going to forbid working with the attached produce in the usual manner even in Syria. Now, the Gemara is going to explain why that is, and it's not for the reason that you think. So, the Rambam says that the produce of Sheviis, whether it's going to be from restricted or non-restricted fields, must be processed in a manner that deviates from the normal procedure. And this Mishnah's prohibition to work, according to the Rambam, with attached produce in Syria, likewise applies to all produce. And the Rosh, by the way, maintains that the produce of an unrestricted field does not require any change in the way of reaping or processing, even in Eretz Yisrael. And according to the Rosh, who's interpreting the Mishnah as referring specifically to produce from a field to which access is restricted, and then they're saying that the field was either owned by a Sheviis violator or it's going to be, according to the Rosh, owned by a non-Jew. So if you have a case where the field belongs to a Jewish Sheviis violator, in the Mishnah's words, they're not going to be addressed to the violator himself, instructing him how to conduct himself when harvesting and processing his field. Why? Because this is for a person who's observing Torah. This is not giving advice on how to do it if you're not observing Sheviis in the Torah. And this Mishnah is addressing Jews who are Sheviis observers, who are looking for work with a Sheviis violator on his farm, and is teaching that they are forbidden to assist him with harvesting his attached produce in the normal manner, but may help him process his detached produce normally. That's what the Rosh is saying about this. And the Chazan Ish is saying about this that the prohibition to work with detached produce does not apply in Syria. The Mishnah contains additional novelty where in Eretz Yisrael is forbidden to help a Sheviis violator process his crop, even in an altered manner, but because you're not allowed to help a sinner. But over here in Syria, it's permissible. That's what the Chazan Ish is pointing out with this novelty. Again, why would that be? Because Syria doesn't have the same status of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Sheviis doesn't have the same status. So you have this Torah observant Jew, and there's not a lot of work in Syria, I guess, and there's a Sheviis violator or a non-Jew at the farm, but let's just say Sheviis violator. And the idea here is that if he's going to go work with the detached produce, then it's fine. He doesn't need to do an altered manner at all, because the produce that's growing up there is not going to have the same level of sanctity. But if this was a Sheviis violator and he goes and gets work from him in Eretz Yisrael, that's in the Ole Bavel area, well, then he can't even work with the detached produce. So the note here is that, but the Mishnah is saying that one may work with detached produce, but not the attached produce. The attached produce is what's going to be problematic on it. Now, the Mishnah is going to talk about examples of the ruling, and it's going to say one may thresh and winnow grain, tread on grapes, heap produce into piles in the normal way, but one may not harvest grain, grapes, or olives in the normal way. So the idea here is that, and by the way, the Tosefta 4:6 is going to add sowing and plowing. That's going to be prohibited during Sheviis, in Syria during Sheviis. And these, by the way, sowing and plowing, which we covered a lot in Sheviis so far, we know that even if you do it in an abnormal way in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to do it. And similarly, it's also, according to this Tosefta, going to be prohibited in Syria. But regarding harvesting grapes and olives, these are examples of tasks that are performed while the produce is still attached to the ground. So that's what's curious about it. The Mishnah is going to continue, and Rabbi Akiva says a general rule. Any activity, the likes of which is permitted in the land of Israel in the normal way according to biblical law, even though the rabbis required it to be performed in an altered way, may be performed in Syria in the normal way, even by rabbinic law. So we have, this, this underlying theme. Syria was not conquered as perhaps a fully legal conquest in terms of the same status of this national war of going and taking back the land from the Canaanites and fulfilling this promise that Hashem gave to the Jewish people. And instead they went over for a more individual war. And so, the question is, according to biblical law, the Sheviis laws are not going to apply there because it's not part of this territory of Israel. So the question is going to be, why are the sages instituting that one should not work with attached produce in Syria? And the other idea here is that processing detached produce in a normal way, we know that that's going to be forbidden in Eretz Yisrael rabbinically. And the biblical obligation to employ a change in the method applies only when harvesting attached produce. So Rabbi Akiva is summing up this law for Syria by saying a simple rule. He says, wherever the activity is biblically permitted in Eretz Yisrael, and then you have a rabbinically forbidden part where it's going to be performed in an altered manner, it's completely permitted in Syria. And he's basically saying that with Syria, all of the activities that you do after reaping, okay, because that's the act of separating produce from the ground, okay? So the problem that you're going to have in Syria is separating the crops from the ground, according to this Mishnah. But after it's been separated by, say, someone else, you can work in it. And the idea is that, if you're reaping attached produce from a field, well, when you open up the Torah and you look at it, you're going to see that it's biblically forbidden in Eretz Yisrael. Now, if you're going to do it in some irregular fashion, that is going to be prohibited. So the idea is, look, if you're reaping in some unusual way, okay, that's going to be allowed in Eretz Yisrael, okay? But that same restriction on reaping is also going to be prohibited in Syria. So you can't just go out and do normal reaping out there, okay? You can't go get your scythe, and you can't just start going and reaping a field like it's year 5. You can't do that. Now, if there's some weird, unusual way to do it, you can do it. But the idea is that in Syria, if you have a restriction that's biblical over here in Eretz Yisrael, they're going to apply it, according to Rabbi Akiva, over in Syria. That's what's so interesting about it. So, the question is that, okay, if you have detached crop from the ground, it can be processed with no change in the method, even according to rabbinic law. And so one way to look at Rabbi Akiva's rule, according to the Beur Halacha and Derech Emunah, is that Rabbi Akiva is saying like this. He's saying that for this rule in the Mishnah, he's saying that any activity the likes of which is completely permitted in Eretz Yisrael, even rabbinically, if the crop was left hefker, meaning after this reaping process of the crop, it's going to be permitted in Syria even if the crop was not left hefker. But reaping, which is rabbinically forbidden in a normal way in Eretz Yisrael, even if the crop was left for hefker, is forbidden in Syria. So we're going to try to uncover why Syria is going to be so unusual in the law. And this is going to sum it up, right? We're going to get right into it right now. So the Mishnah says one may work with detached produce in the normal way in Syria, but not with attached produce. Now, the Gemara is going to wonder, why are the rabbis forbidding working normally with attached produce in Syria? What's the problem with it? What's the problem with attached produce in Syria? And Rabbi Abahu said, it was so that people would not go and settle there, and it's to avoid the Sheviis restrictions of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, according to Rabbi Abahu says, and I believe this is authoritative, the sages don't want people in general to leave Eretz Yisrael and to go into diaspora. So in the case of Syria, when they're looking at the laws, they're trying to establish the laws to discourage people to emigrate and to go move there and live there. And in this way, they were worried that if people could profit from Sheviis and Sheviis produce in nearby Syria, and they could go leave Eretz Yisrael, and they could go earn a living over there in Syria, where on Sheviis earning a living can be difficult, and they could go and settle in Syria and just skip the laws of Sheviis altogether. That you would have a huge rush of people leaving Eretz Yisrael where they have to keep Sheviis and going right over the border and going to a place where they don't have to keep Sheviis. And so according to what Rabbi Abahu is saying, is the rabbis said that all the work on produce attached to the ground is forbidden in Syria, just like Eretz Yisrael. So what they've done is they took away an incentive. They said, look, anyway, this land has this questionable status in terms of Kedusha anyway. In some ways, it's kind of like Eretz Yisrael. In some ways, it's kind of not. Yes, there was a Jewish army that took it, but it was a personal conquest. It wasn't a national conquest. And this was King David. This wasn't just an army. And they're going to say that, look, to keep people from leaving the land and emptying out, and just saying like, look, the laws are too hard. I don't want to learn Torah. It's too complicated to do. And then you have the financial stress. I'm just moving to Syria and not dealing with it altogether. By the sages, according to Rabbi Bahu, coming and saying, no, you still got the same problems that you would have anyway with attached produce. Now people would say, whatever, there's no point to leave, because if I go over there anyway, I got the same headache anyway. So I may as well learn some Torah and learn how to do Sheviis. So the Gemara is going to answer another answer. It's going to say, since the poor man can see the possibility of earning a small profit close by in Syria, he will not leave Eretz Yisrael. In other words, that the sages are permitting work on unattached produce in Syria, because if they were forbidding it, the poor might migrate even further out of diaspora. In other words, the people that you already have living in Syria, which is close by to Eretz Yisrael, if you're saying, look, you have to treat it like Eretz Yisrael fully, and you can't even work this produce afterwards. You can't winnow it. You can't work it. It's forbidden. Then they'd say, why do I need this? I'm moving to Turkey. And they would leave even further away. So they said, look, you want to go work for a non-Jew and you can't reap his grain, but you want to go winnow his grain after it's been cut by someone else, you could do it. And what did that do? It left a very small profit left. And since there's a small profit left, a guy living in Eretz Yisrael could look at it and say, well, it's not like I'm moving to Silicon Valley here. It's not like I'm moving to New York City here, this land of opportunity. Like, that's hard living out there. I mean, I may as well just take my chances and stay here in Eretz Yisrael. So it stops that guy from moving because the profit is little. And the guy who's already living there, he's going to say, look, at least I'm getting something. And, I'm not so disincentivized that I'm just going to say, whatever, I'm just leaving to Turkey, Armenia, somewhere even further away where there's no restrictions at all. So very clever. So the Gemara is going to now tie this back to this Mishnah, and it's all going to connect it. These are the basic ideas on why the laws are the way they are in Syria, and it's an important insight to remember. The Gemara is going to bring up this question about how this is connected now to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Bun, asks in the presence of Rabbi Manna, what is the law with regards to permitting to grind produce in a normal way with a non-Jew in the land of Israel, like in the land of Israel during Sheviis? So grinding is an example of working with detached produce, and Sheviis, it cannot be performed in the normal way in Eretz Yisrael. So the question here is that, over here in Syria, the question is, can you assist a non-Jew to work with this detached produce? And basically what this question is as follows. It says, how did the rabbis formulate their decree? This is an insight from the Pnei Moshe. How did the rabbis formulate their decree against working normally with detached produce? Did they forbid the action per se, or was the decree that the owner not act as an owner normally does? In other words, what this is asking is, if they're forbidding the act, then it would be forbidden for a Jew to work with even normally detached produce for a non-Jew. And if they're forbidding the owner from acting as an owner normally does, then there would be nothing wrong with helping the non-Jew grind his produce, since the non-Jew is not forbidden to act as an owner. And this is also echoed by the Chazan Ish in 323. And so the question is, a deeper question. How did the rabbis formulate this decree against working with detached produce? Okay, and Rabbi Mana is gonna answer this. He said to Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Bun, our Mishnah says that it is forbidden, and we can derive from the Mishnah that it is forbidden for a Jew to grind Sheviis produce with a non-Jew. By the way. So the Mishnah says that it is forbidden, and we learned in this Mishnah one may work with detached produce in the normal manner in Syria, but not with attached produce. So if the majority of the land in Syria is going to belong to non-Jews, implied by this Mishnah's ruling is that within the land of Eretz Yisrael, even working with detached produce with a non-Jew is going to be forbidden. So what this is saying what is going to be the status of working with a non-Jew with detached produce during Sheviis. Now, there's a debate that comes between Eretz Yisrael, between the poskim, on what do you do with land that's owned by a non-Jew, and whether that's going to have Sheviis sanctity. And Rabbi Yosef Karo is holding that it does not. And the Mabit from Chuvos Mabit is saying that, that it does. So each side is going to bring proofs to their opinion, and one of the proofs brought by the Mabit is this actual Gemara, which is stating that it is forbidden to grind produce with a non-Jew. So clearly a non-Jew's produce would have Sheviis sanctity. And Rabbi Yosef Karo is responding that the Gemara can be explained by referring to the produce that grew in the field of a Jew and afterwards was acquired by a non-Jew. And so that could be, that's an interesting response. But again, that gets back to this argument between Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Meir. What is the status of this land and produce even today? And it's if the law is fully going to be like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, then if a non-Jew has detached produce in Eretz Yisrael, there should be no restriction whatsoever to go and work that grain. There should be no problem with it. And so Rabbi Yosef Karo says, well, maybe it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity, and maybe the non-Jew actually purchased it. He actually purchased it from a Jew. So that seems like a stretch, but maybe it's a fence. Maybe Rabbi Yosef Karo is saying that maybe there's a Sheviis merchant, and the non-Jew bought it from a Sheviis merchant, and by continuing to create value down the production chain and to work this produce, that you're in a roundabout economic way, you're creating an incentive to go and violate Sheviis for a Jew. And then what you'd be doing, I think according to Rabbi Yosef Karo, is he's arguing you're creating an economic incentive for Jews to break the laws of Sheviis, go and sell the grain crop to a non-Jew, and then people can go work that grain because they'll say, oh, look, the non-Jew has it, and it must not have sanctity now. And in fact, it does still have sanctity if the non-Jew possesses it, so that if you're like working with this produce, maybe you're in a bakery and you're grinding flour to bake for bread, and you're a miller or something like that, and you have all this detached produce, and perhaps this milling area is owned by a non-Jew, but perhaps the source for all of this grain is coming from Jewish Sheviis violators. So perhaps that is why the rabbis are saying that even within the land, you're not allowed to work this produce. They're trying to cut off an economic incentive to stop a situation where Jews can grow the produce, can sell it to a non-Jew within the land, and then you'll have other Jews coming and working and using this, and in a roundabout way, creating value. Now, if the non-Jew can't get workers, no Jews will come and work and do the work, then there's less incentive to come and buy this grain from the Jewish Sheviis violator. I think that's the point that Rabbi Yosef Karo is making on here, and why, it's interesting that it's coming up over here in the laws of Surya. It's interesting that we didn't have an earlier case where it says that you're not allowed to work with the detached produce of a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael, but nonetheless, that's what we're learning here. In Syria, you can work with the detached produce in Syria. The rabbis said that you can, but in Eretz Yisrael, you can't. So the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, in a place where the produce may be eaten, but the land may not be worked during Sheviis, and these are going to be areas that are conquered by those who are ascending from Egypt, but was not retaken in Bavel. And it's going to ask, what is the law as to regards to if it's permitted to rent out one's animal there? So this is talking about like what we were talking about in chapter 6, Halacha 1, these border areas that were conquered by Joshua and the conquering armies, but were not retaken back by Olei Bavel. And an example of that is the Ashkelon area. And the question is, over there, what's going to be the status? Now, in an area that the produce that's going to grow during Sheviis may be eaten after the time of Beur, one may not work the land, and that's going to be the deal with this land that's going to be in the Olei Mitzrayim territory, but not the Olei Bavel territory. So in Eretz Yisrael proper, in the Olei Bavel territory, it is definitely prohibited for a Jew to rent out his animal to another Jew who is suspected of working the land during Sheviis. And the idea is that you don't want to put a stumbling block in front of the blind, and you don't want to go help him to go commit a crime that's going to go violate the laws of Sheviis. So this came up earlier in chapter 5, and really now what we're asking is, okay, what about in the area of the Olei Mitzrayim? Is it going to be like the law of Olei Bavel? If you're going to go rent a cow to a Jew who's living over there, and that's a good question. This is going to really answer what is the status of it. If you're you can't rent it in the Olei Bavel territory because he's going to go work the field with it, and you're helping him to make Sheviis violations. This is really asking about the nature of the sanctity of the land. And so it's really asking a question, what really is the sanctity level of the land in the Olei Mitzrayim territory that's not Olei Bavel? And it's really saying over there, if you can't rent a cow, over here to work the land, then it must have some sanctity. And the Gemara is going to answer. And Rabbi Levi Tzanbaria asked the question of Rabbi Yitzhak and to Rabbi Imi, and they both prohibited it. So they're basically saying that you're not allowed to give a suspected Sheviis violator the cow, and you're not allowed to rent him the cow because he might want to go use it for plowing. Now, you are allowed to rent out an animal to a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael, because the rabbis are saying that the status on the non-Jew there is going to be different, and the land, this is the rabbis saying it. They're taking the position of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. They're not taking the position of Rabbi Meir in this argument. So Rabbi Kanievsky is pointing out in his Beur shiurim that this Gemara is asking if the rabbis extended the prohibition to a place in which the Sheviis prohibition is only rabbinic, in other words, the area conquered by those ascending from Egypt, but not those ascending from Babel, perhaps in that case the rabbis did not institute the decree to prevent a prohibition that itself would be rabbinic. So the Gemara could have asked this question before, but is waiting until this halacha, according to Rabbi Kanievsky, where we're learning that in Syria, this is also forbidden work with attached produce. And so the Gemara is going to, apply this question to Syria as well, of those areas that are not conquered by the Ole Bavel, to include all of it for this particular kind of work. That's why it wasn't done earlier, according to Rabbi Kanievsky. So that's what this novelty is teaching. So there's going to be another thing about this incident. Rabbi Hoshaya would require people who had rented out their animals to idol worshippers to give the coins they received from the rental to non-Jews. And he did this not because renting to them is forbidden, but rather so that he would not leave his animal alone with an idol worshipper. And basically, we know that in the Mishnah of Avodah Zarah 2:1, it's saying that you're not allowed to leave the animal alone with an idol worshiper because the idol worshippers are suspected of sex crimes with the animals. And so to discourage Jews from renting out the animals to the idol worshippers, Rabbi Hoshaya is requiring them to give away the coins to renting it to a non-Jew, and so that you're really not getting any benefit out of it. Because you're taking away the economic incentive to go rent these to non-Jews, and again, not putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, because they have this taiva at this time to go and to do sex crimes with animals. So rather than giving them the animal for which they would have a problem resisting themselves, they're going to take the economic incentive out of it. They're going to say, if you go do it, well, you didn't get any money out of it because you have to give the coins away. And so now the regular Amaretz Jew would say, whatever, I got to either give away the coins or keep the animal. I'll just keep the animal. And there's no point for me to do it, because anyway, I lose the animal and I lose the coins. So the Gemara is going to talk about the Mishnah's ruling that in Syria you're not allowed to work with attached produce, but you are allowed to work with detached produce. That's always the thing to keep in mind. Attached produce in Syria, no. Detached produce in Syria, yes. So the Gemara says, with what type of produce are we dealing with here? And it says, if we are dealing with produce of the 6th year that entered into Sheviis, in other words, you have a crop and it was planted in the 6th year, but it was not harvested until the 7th year, okay? And sometimes you have that, right? Sometimes you have that with a rice crop. You'll plant the rice crop in July, and that will be in the 6th year. In Eretz Yisrael, they do plant rice in July here, by the way. And in the modern day, wherever they do have a rice crop, which is not much, but they actually do plant rice here a little bit, and that's done in July. And so then it wouldn't be ready for harvest until after Rosh Hashanah in the 7th year. We're talking about a case just like that. And the Gemara says, why, even in the land of Eretz Yisrael, it is permitted to harvest such produce normally, since it does not possess Sheviis sanctity. So if you have rice, and the rice, by the way, we have this in a Mishnah in chapter 2, that rice, how do you determine the year on rice? it's going to be the year it takes root. So if you're planting it in July in the 6th year, it's going to take root about 3 or 4 days afterwards in July. So this is going to be maybe a month and a half before Rosh Hashanah. And then, you're not going to harvest it until about 90 days to 105 days after you planted it. Rice will take about 90 to 105 days to grow. So that puts you right after, that definitely puts you right after Rosh Hashanah. And so then it doesn't have any Sheviis sanctity. And because it doesn't have Sheviis sanctity, you're allowed to harvest that in a normal way. There's no problem with that. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, and if we're dealing with produce of Sheviis that emerged in the year after Sheviis, in other words, you have a crop that grew in Sheviis, but it was not harvested that year and is still attached to the ground on the 8th year. So the Gemara says why to plow at that point is permitted, and only to harvest it is going to be prohibited. Yet the Mishnah is saying that plowing is going to be prohibited. So if you're saying, so let's go back a second, right? So harvesting in the usual way for produce that grew in the 7th year and into the 8th year, that's not allowed because that still has Sheviis sanctity. Even though you're harvesting it in the 8th year, it grew in the 7th year. And so the produce that grew a third, like grain, is a third ripe, or emerged in the case of a fig on the fig tree during Sheviis, it has Sheviis sanctity. And we know that for like figs that emerged during Sheviis, you're supposed to tie ribbons around the figs so that you know this is going to be this year's figs. And in the case of the white figs are going to take a 3-year cycle to ripen, and they're going to grow in stages of 3. And so you can have a case where you have the tree where you have the white figs, and 1/3 of the fruit will be from the 6th year, 1/3 of the fruit will be from the 7th year, and 1/3 of the fruit will be from the 8th year and ready to harvest in the 8th year. So the fruit that's there from the 8th year really grew over in the 6th year. It takes 3 years to grow. So it was continuously growing over Sheviis, but it did not emerge during Sheviis. But about 1/3 of the fruit of the white fig will emerge during Sheviis, and you tie a ribbon around it. And in that case, when you go harvest it 2 years later, it's going to have the ribbon around it, and it's still going to have Sheviis sanctity even after 2 years, because it takes 3 years to ripen. So when you have plowing a field in the 8th year, the question is going to be that if you have produce that grew a third like grain, or it emerges from the tree like a fig, and that happens during Sheviis, it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. And in that case, you cannot harvest it without a change in the way. And so plowing a field in the 8th year is going to be permitted. Why? Because that itself is going to be a deviation by plowing it in the 8th year. That's what it's saying. So a crop that grew in Sheviis but was not harvested until that year, and it was still attached to the ground, it's saying, because we know that that to plow at that point is permitted, and only to harvest it's going to be prohibited. So the question is going to be, in Surya, with something that's attached, the Mishnah is saying that, working the ground itself like plowing, that's not allowed. All right, and the Mishnah is really trying to ask, what about produce that grew in the 8th year when plowing is permitted? So that's another way to look at it. So this is a little bit tricky, a little bit difficult, and the Rosh Surya is going to explain it a little bit differently. He's going to say like this. He's going to say that possible explanation for this Gemara is to question specifically why harvesting it should be forbidden in Syria. And strictly Syria does not have the status of Eretz Yisrael at all, since it is the conquest of an individual. And the only reason that working with attached produce was prohibited was so that the poor would not run out of Eretz Yisrael and go settle in Syria. And so accordingly, it's following that after Sheviis passes, when plowing is once again permitted in Eretz Yisrael and the poor have ample employment opportunities at home, there should be no reason to forbid working with attached produce in Syria. So that's really what this Gemara is asking. And the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, rather, with what case are we dealing with here? With produce of Sheviis during Sheviis. So this is really trying to express that we're not dealing with produce that's from the 6th year that grew in the 7th year. We're not dealing with produce, according to this, of something that is in the 7th year that is harvested in the 8th year, where plowing is allowed again in Syria and in Eretz Yisrael in the 8th year. This is saying that this grew in Sheviis and is being harvested in Sheviis, and that's not allowed over there in Syria. That's what this is trying to say. So the Gemara is going to continue this with another similar incident. Rabbi Huna traveled to Tyre, that's a city in Syria, and he prohibited them watering the fields during Sheviis. That's a really interesting thing, to prohibit them in Sheviis from working the field by watering the field. So there's another Amar who comments about it because it is interesting. Rabbi Yossi heard about Rabbi Huna's ruling and said, it is the proper ruling. And why is this watering not performed on produce attached to the ground, which is forbidden in Syria? So in other words, you're saying, well, wait a second. This is attached to the ground. So really, like, you're just like working with attached produce. You're watering the produce, right? And the Gemara is going to ask a question. It says, but we learned in the Mishnah, one may water an irrigated field during Chol HaMoed and during Sheviis. So the question emerges. It says, wait a second. So why then does Rabbi Huna prohibit watering a field in Syria? So even an irrigated field, okay? So you're permitted to water an irrigated field in Eretz Yisrael, but not in Syria. That's effectively what this ruling is saying. The Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Yudan said it is permitted to water an irrigated field during Sheviis only for the sake of the seeds in it. And Rabbi Huna was prohibiting the Syrians to water their fields for the purpose of the land. So he was saying, look, if you're watering it in Tyre, you're really watering it because you're trying to work the land. And even in Eretz Yisrael, going and watering the field just to get it ready for next year's growing, that's also forbidden because you're improving the quality of the land. And you're just doing the same thing over there in Syria. You're not allowed to do it. But if you're doing it for the sake of the seeds that are in it so that they won't die out, and you're not doing it so that it'll be easy to plow, but you're doing it so that the seeds that you have in the ground don't become ruined, according to Pnei Moshe, then it's going to be allowed. So in one case, they're watering the field to just make it easy to plow and prepare the land for next year. That's not allowed. But if you have seeds in the ground and you don't want them to get destroyed, the seeds to get ruined, and you have a lot of money in these seeds, you're allowed to water the land for the sake of the seeds, but not because you're preparing the ground. The idea is that the ground is irrelevant. You don't care about the preparation of the ground. You only care about preserving the seeds. And if that's your intention, that's allowed. So then Gemara is going to answer and explains that it's for the seeds. Rabbi Yudan says it is permitted to water an irrigated field during Sheviis only for the sake of the seeds. And Rabbi Huna is going to prohibit the Syrians to water the fields for the purpose of the land. And the Gemara is going to object, and it's going to leave an unanswered question. So Rabbi Mana questions this, and he says, if so, it should be even permitted to plow for the sake of the seeds for an irrigated field. So Rabbi Mana, according to Pnei Moshe, says like this. He says, if it's permitted to water a field to prevent the seeds from getting destroyed and ruined, then plowing should also be allowed when it is done for the sake of the seeds. For example, it should be permitted to dig furrows around the perimeter of the field so that it'll become filled with water and it will irrigate the seeds in the field. But they didn't allow that. So that leaves it where you don't know what to do with it. Now, in other words, he allows you to water, Rabbi Yudan allows you to water the seeds for the sake of the seeds if you're not doing it to try to improve the ground over there in Syria. And presumably the same thing would apply in Eretz Yisrael. But if you're saying, well, wait a second, if I can water for the sake of the seeds, why can't I just also plow for the sake of the seeds? And that is going to be prohibited. That's prohibited. You're not allowed to plow. So the question is, why are you allowing it, in this case, for the watering, but not for the plowing? So there must be some deeper point about the nature of the plowing. I would guess that it would be like the case of trying to repair the tree that we had in Halacha 1, where this kind of work, the work over there with the tree that gets prohibited, is work where it's one, good for the tree and saves the tree from being destroyed, but the side effect is that it improves the growing. It improves the growing of the tree, and those applications of mud and sap on the tree are going to be disallowed because it actually improves growth. Yes, you're saving the tree from fungus and things like that and from rot, but when you put it on, not only are you saving the tree, which is allowed, the problem is you are improving it for the growth. And I think that the problem with the plowing over here, Rabbi Yudan probably would come and say, wait a second, it's like the tree, because over here in the water, you're just saving it from being destroyed. It's not going to help you improve the growth for next year. But if you're actually plowing the field, you're really going to be improving the growth for next year because you're getting out all of the weeds, you're burying weeds, your ground is going to be more aerated, it's going to be easier to grow out of, and so there's something inherent about plowing where you're working the field that actually makes the growing better, and that's the problem with the plowing as opposed to just the watering. I think that's going to be the issue here. Now, Halacha 3, we're going to be getting into seeds. So, there's going to be a question, well, what about, Halacha 3 that's still connected with Halacha 2? And we're going to discover that tomorrow because, we left off worrying about seeds. And we're going to continue about seeds in Halacha 3. So have a great day.